Well, it's April 16th, 2024. Sandrine Zerbib, all the way from Brittany. Aldo, Spaanjaars, all the way from Amsterdam. Welcome to BRI Dialogues. It is the first time that we have how do you say, a duo act on the BRI Dialogue. So it's the first, and we very much look forward having both of you on the program. Obviously, your backgrounds are impressive. Sandrine, you're the president of Adidas in Greater China. And of course, a wealth of insight into the foray of multinationals when nobody was familiar with China, and following through with, setting up your own e-commerce company that you had an exit, which is an interesting topic to cover as well, to Baozun Group in China. And of course, your insights into the Chinese culture and the dynamics of Western companies in China would be of great interest. Aldo, you're a man of many hats, of course, a great deal in retail, but also advertising and marketing, and as well with Fosun, J. Walter Thompson, Lacoste, and Adidas, as well as the CEO of Adidas in Greater China, and Lacoste, and COO of Adidas, I should say, and CEO of Lacoste in Greater China. So I have to tell you today, coming online, I was a bit mindful of my style and looks and everything with you both from the world of fashion and retail. But without further ado, of course, your experiences are very much packed in your book, Dragon Tactics. But I wanted to build a bridge, and maybe it would be good to kick off with a bit of insight from both of you on how our cultures were different when you went in, how the cultures remain different, and how these cultural differences are yet to be fully understood by Western decision makers, competition, and incumbents. So why don't we start with the culture, which you have allocated a great deal into your book on the same topic.
Let me just maybe start on this, and maybe Aldo, I'll let you compliment. I think when we arrived approximately the same time in China, which is at the beginning of the 90s, and culture was incredibly different from where we were coming from. It was a shock, but I would say that it has remained incredibly different. What has not remained incredibly different is the standard of living. So I think we need to separate standard of living, which has increased and improved tremendously, and makes a Westerner, when he arrives first time in China, more familiar with his environment than it was for us back in the 90s. But don't get deluded by this kind of similarity in standard of living, particularly in the big cities. In fact, it doesn't mean the culture has changed that much. So that's the first point I'd like to make, and maybe Aldo, you want to pursue on this.
But it's also clear that when it comes to culture, when we first went to China, the Chinese very much looked abroad to learn. They realized they were different, and they thought they could learn a lot from the West. And of course, that was the case. People like Sandrine and myself, we could really add value in the early days. But I think what a lot of people are underestimating is that we in the West expected that the Chinese would become more like us. But I think they increasingly realize that actually they also have significant capabilities and knowledge. And what you see today is that they have taken or learned from the West, but increasingly they're doing very much their own thing and following their own culture and their own beliefs. So I believe that China increasingly less needs the West in order to advance. Whereas on the other side, I think from the West, it is time we try to learn more about how the Chinese operate, because there are many things that we can learn from them in a world that also is changing in the West.
Yeah, that's a fantastic start, both of you. But there is this palpable suspicion all over the West in particular about China's motives, about its, you know, you both are familiar with the Confucius Institutes, that somehow they're part of this grander Chinese conspiracy to dominate the world. You know, the picture we draw of China in the West sits in very sharp contrast of China's own image of itself, but also of the global South image of China. So how do the Chinese authorities manage this tension there? And of their own, what do they promote of their cultural values to not be exceptionalist, but also relate to their differences as being added value?
It's a complex topic because number one, I really don't think that China wants to dominate the world. In fact, I think they want this less than some other Western countries. However, what they want is to take some sort of revenge over history because they see themselves as a great civilization with a great history, and they want to be put back where they belong to, where they believe they belong to, which is at the forefront because they're a great civilization. And this is what they want. And this actually gives them also a voice. They believe that it gives them a voice with the global South because they think that this desire to be back on stage where they should be and where they should have been from day one actually echoes some of the same with the global South at large. And I think this creates a lot of misunderstandings, all the more so as there is a lot of awkwardness in the Chinese way of expressing this. Plus, let's admit it, a lot of more than awkwardness, I would even say mistakes from the current authorities in China that leads to even more misunderstanding and tension. But fundamentally, the story is there. They want to be back on stage.
And I think also we need to separate political developments with business and company developments. Chinese companies are the same compared to companies in the West. They want to just be big and make sure that consumers and clients buy their products. And if that means becoming a global player, then that means to become a global player. So I think that yes, on the political side, there are challenges that in the West we need to deal with, whether we like it or not. But I think at the same time, it does not make sense that we become extremely negative about a lot of the Chinese companies, because they really do bring good products. They really do bring different management techniques, where also in the West we can benefit from. Even if we don't buy their products, which we certainly learn from them by helping ourselves to stay and become more competitive. So yes, there will be a growth, a globalization of Chinese companies coming. And whether we like the political environment or not, we better get prepared, because these companies are on their way. And unless our governments are going to legislate all of them out of the market, which I simply don't see as a realistic option, we better understand what is coming at us when it comes to Chinese companies, and more importantly, what we can do to stay competitive.
That is really interesting note to connect with, Aldo, because you three aren't, but I'm old enough to remember when Japanese companies were being ostracized, when Toyotas of this world were being seen as dominant aggressors. The yellow peril was the message that was coming across, particularly in the United States. But then the Japanese started to adapt and started kind of wearing some of the garb of the West. They started moving manufacturing to the United States. They started building Nissan cars in Sunderland, near where I am, and started using the language, even though the management style was very different, even though their business culture was very different, but started to be a chameleon when it came in dealing with the West. Sandrine has already noted that the Chinese haven't quite wised up to this yet.
No.
How do you think, given that unlike Japan, China sees itself as an independent pillar of the national system, How will they adjust their ways to what they perceive as Western arrogance, do you think?
I think, again, we need to separate the political world and the world of business, I would say. And I will leave aside the political world because we're not political experts. So I'll leave this aside. But if you look at the world of business, actually, they are learning as they are running. And you can see that companies like, particularly I would mention these three, but actually there are others, but let's look at TikTok, Shein, Temu. They are under huge attacks and everything on earth is, they are blamed with. And what is interesting is that they thought at the beginning that what they were doing was fine. And in fact, there is nothing absolutely wrong, but I think little by little they understand. And I think that they need indeed to adjust without changing who they are. And it's interesting. Let me take the example of Shein. Shein, since I would say in the last 6 months, have started to go after Western executives of very high ranking to fill their ranks and to really help them bridge this gap with, particularly in the United States. So they've gone for high-ranking American executives to help them with questions like CSG, to help them with cybersecurity topics, with legal topics, with counterfeit topics, everything they were blamed with, basically. And this is a first step towards going this direction. It will take a while, but I think they will get there.
Aldo, if you want,
I'd like to go back, Anoush, to what you said about the 1980s with Japanese competition, because I agree with what you said, but you overlooked one important thing. The Japanese were blamed to dump cars here because they were government sponsored. But when actually management from Western companies went to Japan, they realized Japanese companies operated very differently. They learned about Kaizen. They learned about just-in-time management. They learned about total quality management. Well, at the time, European and American cars were of extreme poor quality. But when Western manufacturers started implementing a lot of these learnings, like Kaizen, total quality management, all of a sudden they could compete again. So yes, it is very easy to say, oh, they're all government sponsored and they're dumping cars here. But what Sandrine and I are advocating is maybe you should actually go and have a look at how these companies work and how they manufacture, because Chinese companies do things very differently. Hence what I said at the beginning, the post that I wrote this morning on LinkedIn is exactly about that same topic. If you actually go across to China and you study these companies, you see they operate in such a different way that makes them much faster, much more agile, and therefore their products ultimately are much more suited to what markets need in a much more timely manner. Western companies have no choice but to start learning some of those capabilities like they had to in the 1980s in order to be able to compete.
And what is interesting in this context of what Aldo just developed, and going back to Shein, I was talking about these Western executives that have joined Shein recently. One of them, for instance, is Frances Townsend. And one of the first things she did was to go to China and see some manufacturing facilities used by Shein. It's not their own, but it's one of their several thousand suppliers. And she was amazed because I think the image we have is that it's horrible workshops with children working 15 hours a day and so on and so forth. And she was amazed by the quality of the manufacturing, by the processes at work, the quality of the execution, the automation level, and so on and so forth. And I think that it was so helpful for her to go there and to bring back, this the learnings she had in China to the US to say, listen, guys, it's not exactly what you think.
Well, I think you both touched something very interesting, which comes across in your book as well, and that is the role of family. you know, that sense of benevolent entrepreneurial wolf pack mentality that you've talked about. And with poaching of human capital and senior executives, one would think that there will be a reverse osmosis of some of those practices in, you know, in the corporate world here, where we think that, you know, by playing with terminologies, it used to be downsizing when we fire people for shareholder value. Now it's right sizing, you know. So I think we get away a lot with maybe we need right assessment of our competitors. But can both of you touch a bit about this adapt or die? And is this something that we need a rude awakening, that by just, as you rightly said, Aldo, barriers and tariffs, it's not going to work? I mean, Tesla is laying off 10% of its workforce globally, which is, you know, and Xiaomi is moving into EV cars. Are we in denial? When I used to lose my hair, I was applying all the wrong products, and I thought that the mirror is lying. And then I realized, no, I have to get used to it. Are we in denial in terms of adapt or die? And how will that be taken along the Belt Road Initiative? You know, oh, their projects are terrible while our bridges are crumbling in our own countries in Western Hemisphere. But where do you think is the disconnect?
Number one, the disconnect is the denial. I would say it's a double denial. Number one, it's more political than anything else, because if you talk to business people, there are lots of things they know which are not reflected in the media or in the political language, because these business people, they've been in China, they've seen this. They've seen, you know, the progress and the quality and so on and so forth. So that's one thing. Second thing, we know that when you are losing, I'm sorry to say this not your hair, I'm not talking about your hair. when you are on a downtrend, you tend to go in denial even more so, because it's self-protection. It's obviously, it's delusive, but it is self-protection. So we see a lot of this. Now, having said this adapt or die, I think it's, of anything we talk about in the book, it's the most crucial one. Because when you have entered the world we are in, which is really absolute uncertainty, the one who will be able to overcome this uncertainty and navigate in uncertainty will be the leader and the winner. And I think this is what we learn first and foremost from Chinese companies and Chinese entrepreneurs. And we see some Western entrepreneurs going there, but still with a lot of resistance, because it's years and years that we work differently. And it's very difficult to accept to change so deeply, your way of doing things. So this is probably, for me, the one that most urgently needs to be, the one tactics that most urgently needs to be acquired, I would say, by Western enterprises, because it's a matter of survival.
So actually in the West, a lot of the Western companies, multinationals, have lost their entrepreneurial spirit. A lot of companies were founders led 50 years ago, 100 years ago, and they were much more adaptable and flexible than the companies are these days. And what Sandrine and I are arguing is that you can actually build processes into your company where you can become much more agile. You can do a lot by changing the way you hire people, which people you hire, to make your organization more agile and more entrepreneurial. And of course, leadership will need to really start implementing thinking towards having people think less in fixed strategic plans, but in much more replanning type processes, and adopting much more agility in strategic planning and in business management. We believe these things can be learned. It will be a challenge, because if you are used to working in a certain way for a very long time, it is a challenge to adapt. I've done several turnarounds in my career. And the biggest challenge is always to get the team to think differently. But once they go, they can be agile. So a lot of multinationals, a lot of small, medium enterprises, will have to start learning how to become more agile, because in the world that lays ahead us, as Sandrine said, there will be a lot more uncertainty, and people that are able to move quickly and to reinvent themselves within this uncertain world will be the winners of tomorrow.
So here's one for you both as entrepreneurs. So we've had the privilege of thousands, hundreds of thousands of young Chinese students coming to the West to study our ways, to learn about themselves as much as about us, to do MBAs, to do management programs, to do economics, and so on. And the bulk of them are now back in China, folks, right? Yeah. So what is the relationship between what they've picked up from our side and how they adapt it to their side?
Well, I think it's a very interesting question, because I think it's also a question of generation. The people you're talking about, they are younger than the founders of most of the first and second generation of company founders. So this first and second generation, they hadn't had the opportunity to look at such different ways and to go to MBAs and so on and so forth. So they did it their own way. And it was sometimes a bit chaotic. They learned as they, on the go. And I think this new generation, they bring back some knowledge from the West, but they try to really mix the best of both worlds. So on the one hand, they learn about certain ways of structuring things, for instance, in a more Western way. They also learn from their counterparts about young people and how they react to what the older people or more mature managers or entrepreneurs are used to. And for instance, typically in China, you had these 996 things where people had to work for very long hours, and it was really part of the corporate culture. And this is changing. And you have to deal with a younger generation that no longer accepts this. So now these people who've been in the West, they come back, they know this. And however, they keep some fundamental elements that come from their culture. And it's really, the culture is almost a combination of deep culture like Confucianism, and technology. So when they combine all this, they come with the modern, I would say, Chinese corporate or even entrepreneurial culture, and they really try to put it both together in a very efficient way. So to some extent, it's even more threatening because they have both.
And increasingly, they're also learning what they actually have. Some of the most interesting talks I've done, it was at universities. And every time there were Chinese students in the audience, and there was this thing on the screen, dragon tactics, how Chinese thrive in uncertainty, and there's this white guy standing, and you see really skepticism on the faces of the Chinese in the audience. But lo and behold, every time I did this, the Chinese students are the last one to leave, because they engage the most with me afterwards, because they're actually very interested that a Westerner has been able to describe how the Chinese work. And we end up having fantastic debates about the pros and cons of the way Westerners work and the way Chinese work. And actually, a lot of the Chinese students don't even realize the way they work, because they think they have to learn from new knowledge. But actually, when you start discussing with them the merits of how they actually work, they're actually very surprised. They say, oh yeah, that's how we work. For them, it's completely normal. But they don't realize that in many ways, especially in the current more uncertainty also in the West, a lot of these capabilities actually go a long way. So yes, they will go back, and they have gone back with lots of learnings. But as we started the conversation, they have become modernized. They have not necessarily become more Westernized. They apply the knowledge, but they do that within their own cultural framework.
That is a very interesting segue to my next question. And I wanted to share something with the three of you. Over the weekend and anticipating our call and session, I was thinking that today, if you pull the brakes on a hot day in Amsterdam and ask everybody to disembark from the tram, or here in King's Cross, and ask everybody to take completely naked and take all of their clothes and stack up everything they're carrying and take an audit of what is manufactured in China, or Asia for that matter, but predominantly China, hardly anything has been produced here. A lot of designs are here from, Apple and, iPhones and iWatches, Sir John Ive and all of that, but manufacturing is there. So are we entering an era, based on your experience, that in the global design as well, in terms of standards, in terms of products, in terms of EVs, is that part of the next phase of the transformation of China, that China may come out with a design and a manufacturing of a new world order? I'm weaving back to Anu's, question. Are we on the cusp of seeing, well, we're running out of ideas as well for development in the global South? And is that some, some sort of connectivity between these things?
I would say that it's already the case. I'm not saying that we've lost on design in the West, but definitely China has completely entered this new era where their design capabilities are improving at an incredible speed. And it's true for anything. You were talking about iPhone, but if you look at what Xiaomi produces, design is at the center of Xiaomi products, as an example. If you look at electric vehicles in China, at least in the high-end parts, it's very good designs and very comfortable as well. If you look at clothing, be it in sports or in fashion or even high fashion, not luxury yet, but fashion, sports, high fashion, you see more and more very talented Chinese designers. So it's already here. It's nothing new.
But Sandrine, I was building a bridge that the next stage is in the world order as well, in the design and, the way they deal with the world.
I understand.
Not through their products, but through their geopolitics as well.
I think that, again, you're sort of dragging us to politics where we would like to stay in business. But I would say that in the current, I'll be very quick on this, but I think in the current situation, it's not there yet because there is too much tension and aggressivity for a world order to be thought about in a way which is neutral and is just for the good of humanity. It's not the way it's being thought at the moment. It's too much in a context of conflict. And also, I think that China coming out of where they used to be to the front of the stage as they are doing this now is relatively recent, is not fully mature. And I don't think they fully face their responsibilities, or at least the responsibilities that come along with this.
I think I can actually answer your question, Ali, without going into politics, because a new world order also means at the business level. So meaning significant Chinese multinationals that play an important role. And I am convinced that that will happen. And as these companies venture out of their home market, they realize that certain capabilities are needed. If you want to compete in the West, you need to have very well designed products. If that is not your immediate capability, you will insource that capability. So you see a lot of companies in China have hired Western designers. They're working with design firms across the world where they have the best possible talent. So not only do they have superior manufacturing capabilities and increasingly superior digital capabilities, they will definitely acquire all the design capabilities they need. My last job was at Anta, which is the third, actually by now the second largest sportswear company globally. And the keyword that was being used probably every hour was the word innovation. There was this massive drive in the company to be extremely innovative. And that is not just within Anta. If you read the Chinese internet and if you listen to stories about Chinese businesses, every business in China that wants to be competitive, stay competitive, and ultimately go abroad will have innovation at a very high level of their priorities. And with innovation comes design. So these companies will play a significant role in the next 10 to 15 years. And whether it is political or not, these Chinese companies will maybe not dominate, because for them, domination is not necessarily what they're after, but they will play a significant role in markets that are increasingly not well served by Western companies. So the theory is we can legislate them out of the West, but then we don't compete with them here. But do we then give up being global multinationals? Because we can legislate them out of our own country, but that doesn't mean we can compete. And now how are we going to compete in Southeast Asia? How are we going to compete in Africa? How are we going to compete in Latin America? Significant parts of global reach for global companies. So you have to take them serious. You have to learn how to compete with them.
Aldo, this is such an interesting debate we are having. So let's not look to next 10, 15 years. Look at the next 5 years. Dare I say even next year, when the prospects of Trump returning to the White House puts a shiver up my spine. But so on the one hand, there is this perception that China's economy is slowing down and that it is maturing and that it is reaching a plateau. That debate is out there. The perception of it is obviously having an impact on key economic decision makers. That's the one side of it. Mm. The other side of it is Biden's IRA Act, which seems to be sucking in. Samsung is the latest one, Taiwanese companies as well, to taking some of their high-tech industries to the United States, to mainland United States. You put those two together, and then my link is the discussions about supply chains and value chains. Given what you both said, Sandrine and Aldo, you know, if the Chinese economy is slowing down, then the corporations are likely to accelerate their expansion globally. Yes. Say, right? And yet, what we're trying to do in the West is to limit the value and supply chains, which doesn't make sense in an interdependent, globalized world economy. Hmm. How do you think these tensions are going to work themselves out in the next few years? You know, we know that the Chancellor Schultz has gone to China to try and mend bridges. We know that Biden speaks to President Xi fairly regularly, much more so than Trump used to do. So there seems to be awareness of these tensions. How are they seeping into the business world? And how are corporates trying to manage this minefield?
It is a minefield, therefore it's complicated because it's a huge uncertainty both ways. If you look at multinationals working in China, some of them, I mean, a lot of them are talking about not decoupling, because decoupling is actually not very realistic, but a lot of them are talking about de-risking. De-risking means we don't know what's going to happen. There can be something huge happening, and therefore we need to, one, reduce our dependence on Chinese supply chain, and two, reduce our dependence on Chinese market for some of them, which are already very dependent on Chinese market in certain areas. But reversely, you see the same. You see Chinese companies, be it in electronic vehicle or in platforms or like marketplaces and so on and so forth. On the one hand, they are in full speed expansion abroad, but on the other hand, they are faced with a lot of obstacles which are every day put in front of them by, especially in the US, but also in Europe to some extent. So everybody's trying to keep things balanced, to say, okay, let's de-risk without decoupling. Let's continue, for the Chinese ones, let's continue our growth in these markets and find ways of convincing that we're not the devil. But we don't know where it's going. It's full uncertainty.
So the advice I give a lot of companies whenever I get the chance is to say you need to have a dual track. Bar the big world game changer of China one day and with force taking Taiwan, I see no reason not to do business in and with China. I have very low percentage expectations that the Taiwan question ever will happen. So if that never happens, there is no reason not to continue to do business with China. At the same time, as Sandrine is saying, companies need to be aware that you need to risk manage. Having all your manufacturing in China, for me, is not a China problem. It's more a business management problem because you're putting all your eggs in one basket. And that is, from a risk management, simply not the right thing to do. So the dual track is continue to do business in China and with China. You need to be in China to learn competitive forces. If you can be competitive in China, you can be competitive globally. So you need to be in China there to basically to be close to the fire. At the same time, see where you can de-risk, move some manufacturing out. And at the same time, we need to work with our legislators to see what is allowed in the West and what is not allowed. I don't believe in a blanket, we cannot do business with the Chinese decree. That doesn't make sense. But at the same time, I agree, we need to play as possible on a level playing field. And of course, we need to also understand that there are geopolitical risks and that as Western societies, we need to deal with that. And that means for specific technologies, we need to be extremely reluctant in sharing all our knowledge or giving our knowledge away. Again, that does not mean we should not be in China. Anyone who uses the word decoupling, in my opinion, doesn't know what they're talking about. Europe has a 2 trillion a year financial interdependence with China. How are you going to decouple that? McKinsey did a study where they said that 100 million people in Asia today are making things for Europe. The majority of these people are in China. They have a child and they have a wife, at least. So that's 300 million people. And now we're going to decouple and we're going to make all this stuff somewhere else all of a sudden. Here in Europe, well, to begin with, we don't have the 300 million people. And if we have them, we have no housing for them. So the idea of decoupling, I believe, sounds great in the headline in a newspaper, but is far away from the realities that even as the West we would need. Can you imagine the shock, the inflation shock it will have if we start producing everything we produce in China today here in the West? Consumers will never accept and cannot afford these level of price increases. So continue to engage with China, do your business in and with China, but be mindful where they are a geopolitical challenger. So I love Ursula von der Leyen's sum up of China is a partner, a competitor, and a systemic rival. And as long as we have policies for all three, let's engage where we can.
Well, I want to take you both back to your days on the ground and managing teams. One of the biggest challenges that China is facing today is demographics. And there is a big delta between the education, thanks to great institutions like Durham University, where all these students go back and they don't want to go behind the press machine at Haier or at, other manufacturers. Where the two of you think this delta will be managed based on their adaptability, their wolf pack approach, the family, the culture? Is that something that the two of you think will be an Achilles heel for China? Or do you think, based on all of your observations, they will adapt to fill that gap between the expectations of an ultra well-educated workforce and the low, availability of jobs and market in that sense?
In fact, I think not only they will adapt, but they are adapting. Adaptation obviously is a painful process. And to some extent, I would say that we see this from our Western perspective as so painful that it's impossible. But in fact, in China, people are more enduring. And I would say that their ability to face painful transition is probably higher because also their recent history has been tougher than ours. So what you can see that is that actually it's not just the fact, oh my God, it's a catastrophe. You have a lot of young people on the market and they don't have jobs and so on and so forth. It's just also that, I mean, it's not just, but it's also what we are faced with, that there is indeed a discrepancy between what they've been educated for and the jobs that are available. Now, this discrepancy will over time be overcome. It's not overcome yet. But if you look at what China is doing in terms of adapting to, for instance, all the new jobs that will be destroyed, but also created by artificial intelligence, I think they are ahead of a lot of Western countries in this area. And this is the kind of sort of a process they will go through. And similarly, I think that China has been now for, I would say, about 10, 12 years, very aware of this demographic situation, of the fact that what had enabled them to grow so fast in the last 30 to 40 years was this incredible asset they had with a huge population, and that this incredible asset will come to a certain end, not complete, but certain end, and that they had to engage much more solidly in technology, which they have done in the last 15 years, I would say, because they know that they need to change from a number of people assets to technology in order to overcome this demographic risk. So they've taken some steps to go through this transition. Obviously, some moments of the transition are painful, but this transition is happening.
Aldo, do you not like to weave into that, or you're good with it?
To a certain extent, I'm good, but I also want to say that in the West, actually, we face similar challenges.
Yes.
Today, we have lots of academics out of jobs, and we can't find a plumber. And I guess that also means that we need to go through a recalibration of what kind of jobs do we need and want. And I think China will need to go through that same process. In China at the moment, youth unemployment is definitely higher than it is in the West. But this is also where Chinese Gen Z will need to realize that trees don't simply grow into the sky always. And they may also need to adapt personally. In the early 90s, there was a recession in Europe. It was very difficult for me to find a job. So I got myself on a train and a plane, and I went to Hong Kong to look for a job, and I built my career there. I think Chinese youth will have to do the same. Maybe there's no job in Shanghai where they're from, but there may be a job further into the country where they can still thrive and grow. So I think these adaptations will have to take place. It's going to be painful at times, but I'm sure a lot of kids will ultimately find their way, and youth unemployment will come down. Because at the same time, if more people drop off on the upper side, more opportunities will arise at the bottom.
Yeah, all the more so as you still have, I would say, a more centralized authority, and you also have a sense of a collective sense that would actually help people to go through this transition together in a way which is probably a little bit more harmonious than in more individualistic societies.
They have more airbags around them at the cultural level. I understand that. But I want to come to our closing question. And this is for both of you. As snappy, as quick, but you have to answer it separately. You cannot work as a team here.
Mm-hmm.
For each of you, your single most important piece of advice to cinephobes and to cinephiles. Sandrine, you first.
Okay. Cinephobes, open your eyes, learn from others. Cinephile, don't be naive. And, learn from the past in order to be better prepared to compete with Chinese.
Aldo, you cannot repeat her answers. Don't be naughty.
I cannot repeat her, but it's going to show that Sandrine and I have worked together for a very long time, because when it comes to xenophobes, I would say go to China, understand what is happening. It is very easy to read a newspaper and be negative about it. but you have no understanding really what is happening. To China Files, who Sandrine and I can be counted to, is we need to be aware that there are forces that will make it difficult. Having said that, I still feel that we need to keep talking in a positive way, and we need to continue to explain what is actually happening on the ground, because ultimately, as a Western society, we can benefit significantly from understanding and working together.
Sandrine and Aldo, I hope that Ali and I have provided the platform that you can get that message across to as wide an audience as possible. Ali and I know that you're both very active on that front, as well as being very successful entrepreneurs in your own right. But we were very much looking forward to having you with us so that we can hear your experiences of China. Not just experience of China, but experience of China. Mm-hmm. And through our conversation, you've shown that brilliantly. Ali and I very much enjoyed Dragon Tactics. As I've been listening to you both over the last nearly an hour, I was thinking, when are they going to start writing Dragon Strategies as the next step in the evolution of their ideas? Because that is where my sense is where you're going to take this agenda, that given what you've said about China, given what you've said about its dynamism at home, but appetite abroad, we need to better understand also the Dragon strategies that must be driving this appetite and so on. I can't thank you enough for having been so open in the conversation with us, to share your experiences and your wisdom with us. And we hope that we can have you both again before Dragon Strategies is published, so that we can talk about the thought processes that might get you there. In the meanwhile, I wish you both a really, really good experiences as you continue to engage with China and enlighten us about China. So thank you very much.
And
thank you very much.
Closing that, I remember Bruce Lee's movie as well, Let the Dragon Enter. The dragon is here, and we need more reading of how to deal with it. Lovely to have you both with us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.